All right, welcome back. You know my name, Miss Puka, but I would really love if you guys call me U.S. History Diva. So I want to quickly go over some major key points surrounding Reconstruction. But before I do that, I just want to emphasize on how the Civil War ended. So a few things took place right at the end of the Civil War. On your test, you may see it coined as consequences. Consequences has the same meaning of effects. What were the effects of the Civil War? Well, for one, the Union has now been preserved, so the North and the South can now come back together. Slavery has officially been abolished, not through the Emancipation Proclamation, as I stated before, but through the 13th Amendment. All right, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the federal government now has more power, more control. So that idea of state rights, it's still being discussed, but states did not have a lot of rights at the end of this war. If you take AP government, hint, you'll see that this battle for power continues up until today. All right, so those were the consequences. What happens to Abraham Lincoln? Assassinated. All right, so Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and Andrew Johnson, who we don't really care for, becomes the next president of the United States according to the line of succession. All right, so let's get into it. The way that I usually go over Reconstruction, and the way I hope students digested this topic when I went over it with them in class, was to look at it from a positive and negative aspect. So what were some positives surrounding Reconstruction? Well, like I said before, the Union is back together. It's like having a husband and wife, and they've been separated for 2 years. They're dating, doing their own thing, and then they finally come to the realization that, you know what, there's no one else out there that can make me feel as good as you do. I love you. Let's get back together. But you know how it goes down. When couples are trying to get back together, it sometimes requires therapy. So when I think of therapy in regards to Reconstruction, I am looking at the 3 Reconstruction plans that were proposed by Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and the Radical Republicans. Now, for your upcoming test, what do you need to know about these plans? Well, for one, Abraham Lincoln's plan is better known as the 10% plan because he only required 10% of the residents of each Confederate state to pledge their allegiance in order to be readmitted. Johnson's plan was really nothing. He just wanted them to come back to the Union and regain their power because Andrew Johnson was a former slave owner. So, you do the math in terms of how much work he wanted them to put in to come back to the Union. All right, so we often in U.S. history label Lincoln and Johnson's plan as being lenient. Lenient, meaning super easy, mad easy. If I wanted to compare it to a married couple, girl, you didn't have to do much to come back. You just let him in, child. That is lenient, all right? So their plans were lenient, which is why the Radical Republicans created their own Reconstruction plan and said, hold up, there needs to be more. We can't just let them back in without any type of consequences or, I would say, guidelines put in place to help African Americans, because the Radical Republicans were not playing when it came down to providing equality for African Americans. So their plan is much different from, I wouldn't say much, very different from Lincoln and Johnson's plan in that they provided assistance for African Americans. So let's talk about their plan. Their plan required the Confederate States to not only just ratify the 13th Amendment, but also ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment. So we consider the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to be Civil War amendments. You need to know those amendments. I repeat, you need to know the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment, abolishment of slavery. 14th Amendment gave African Americans citizenship rights. Now, why was the 14th Amendment necessary? Why do you have to create a law now labeling freed individuals as citizens? Well, if you go back and look at a court case titled Dred Scott versus Sanford, that court case labeled and classified African Americans as being property. So the 14th Amendment nullified. It struck down. That's what it means to nullify. It now forces us to say the outcome of that case doesn't matter. In other words, what the courts were stating in that case were lies. They're not property, they're people. And now that they're free, they deserve to also be considered citizens. Keep that in mind. I repeat, 14th Amendment made the Dred Scott versus Sanford case null and void. And then you have your 15th Amendment, which gave black males the right to vote, something that women were not too happy about because they viewed this as an opportunity for them to also have the right to vote. But their movement comes up really soon, and you'll see that during the Progressive Era with the enactment of the 19th Amendment. So they're back together again. We have these plans to make sure that this marriage is solid. Between those three plans, we love the Radical Republicans plan because, of course, it incorporated amendments that would help promote equality among blacks and whites. So other things that were done besides the 14th and 15th Amendment, they created 5 military districts in the South. And that gave the federal government authorization to send troops to the South if and when it was needed. And trust me, it was needed. We'll talk about that really soon. In addition to amendments, creating military districts, they created an agency called the Freedmen's Bureau. I repeat, the Freedmen's Bureau. The best way to get you guys to understand it is to think of any child protective services. I work here in the state of Florida, so that would be the Department of Children and Families. And overall, they provide social services. And that was the main purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau. It was to provide social services to African Americans that needed help with adjusting to living as a free person. I mean, it sounds like it's not a big deal, but this was a very huge, big deal. Psychologically, you've been trained to be a slave, and now you have this freedom. What's next? How do I get a job? Where am I now going to stay? I mean, those are some major, major questions. And thankfully, the Radical Republicans, as well as a group called the Carpetbaggers, helped launch this agency. Who were the Carpetbaggers? Remember, they packed all of their belongings in a carpet, wrapped it up, and they moved. Where are they moving from? The north to the south. Some came to work as agents for the Freedmen's Bureau. Others had their own agenda. But if I had to sum it up, the Carpetbaggers were also helpful when you look at African Americans. So a lot of good was coming out of Reconstruction. And for the most part, that's what the Radical Republicans were hoping for. Unfortunately, where there's a positive, in most cases there are some negatives. So the Radical Republicans struggled during this 12-year era. They struggled because white Southerners were hostile. They were upset. They weren't ready to treat former slaves as their equal. So as a result of that hostility, it did result in a lot of violence. And a lot of that violence was led by a group that we all know called the Ku Klux Klan. This is when the KKK originated and launched their crusade against African Americans. As a result of so much violence, the radical Republicans had to enact more laws to protect African Americans. Those laws are called the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. I am stressing it because it will be on your test. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871 basically gave the federal government the authorization to send troops down south to protect people on a day-to-day basis. That should demonstrate or illustrate the extent of how hostile the South was towards African Americans. Some other negatives. Southern states started to implement a series called Black Codes. Black Codes were created to pretty much reinstitute slavery, restrict African Americans from daily life. What were some examples of Black Codes? Initiating curfews, restricting them in terms of where they would like to live, not giving them access to educational facilities, which was major and necessary because most of them were not able to read or write. So the radical Republicans were successful in making Black codes illegal, but they responded to the nullification of Black codes by creating another series of laws called Jim Crow laws. Now, this won't be on your test for this unit, but I still want to share this with you. Jim Crow laws were created from another court case. The title of that court case is Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson created this separate but equal doctrine, meaning we won't restrict, but what we can do is separate as long as those facilities are equal. So now you have Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws, we have plenty of examples: separate restrooms, separate schools, designated areas for those that would like to go out and just have lunch or dinner. These laws, believe it or not, lasted for 100 years. 100 years of living in separation based on race. Okay? Who was in support of such laws? Our president at the time, Andrew Johnson, he supported Black codes. He supported Jim Crow laws because he believed in white supremacy. What he did not support, the Freedmen's Bureau. He was against the Freedmen's Bureau so much that he made several attempts to shut the agency down. And you know who got pissed off? The radical Republicans. So their response to his disgust for their crusade, their campaign, was to impeach him. They wanted to remove him. They was like, you know what? He's got to go. So just to kind of give you a little bit of some background knowledge, in order to impeach a president, the House of Representatives must vote in favor of it. Then the president goes to trial before the Senate, and the Senate has to also vote on it by a 2/3 majority vote. Long story short, Andrew Johnson was recommended for impeachment by the House of Representatives. It's safe to say he was impeached by the House, but he was not removed from his position because they failed to get the necessary votes in the Senate. So I always tell kids, only 2 presidents have been recommended for impeachment. That's Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, but they were never fully removed. Okay? So back to the negative aspects of Reconstruction, hostility and violence through the KKK, Black codes, Jim Crow laws. We have Andrew Johnson, who's stalling this progress that was necessary for African Americans. And in addition to Jim Crow laws, a series of laws were created to circumvent the 15th Amendment. What's the 15th Amendment? Black males can now vote. According to the 15th Amendment, black males can vote, but the South was creating laws to undermine, manipulate the 15th Amendment. what laws were created? Number one, poll taxes. In other words, if you would like to vote, you have to what? Pay. Come on. You know those people didn't have any money. Okay? And if they did, are you going to spend your last to exercise your right to vote? Or are you going to feed your family? You know the answer to that. So that was one way of circumventing the 15th Amendment. Second way was the literacy test. So now I have to demonstrate, or they had to demonstrate, that they were able to read and write. Former slaves now having to demonstrate mastery of reading and writing. You already know what the outcome will be. They can't pass the test. Remember, under slavery, education was not provided. In fact, it was illegal to read and write. So that was their second way of circumventing, undermining the 15th Amendment. Now, with the poll tax and literacy test, not only did it affect African Americans, it also affected white Americans. So now, these laws that were created to keep one group out is also excluding the majority. So, of course, you have to find a way to accommodate the white men that were not able to pay or pass the literacy test. So that brings up number 3, the grandfather clause. What does the grandfather clause state? Basically, if your grandfather was a free man, then despite you not having the money, despite you not passing the test, you can vote. How does this keep black men out? Let's use an example. Let's say black men did have the money and they were able to read and write. That grandfather clause will still keep them from voting because according to the guidelines, your grandfather had to be a free man. So there you have it. 3 laws created to undermine the 15th Amendment. All right, so yes, a lot of good came out of Reconstruction. And if I had to choose my top 3 positives, it would be 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau was great. It did assist African Americans, but eventually it was shut down. It was shut down. And I mean, the negatives towards the end of Reconstruction outweighed the positives because the radical Republicans were losing their power in Congress, and the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Democrat, symbolized the end of this era. Once Rutherford B. Hayes became president, the Democrats in the South regained their power, and now what we will see is 100 years of oppression. I mean, truth be told, African Americans won't see the light until the Civil Rights Movement. So this wraps up my take on the Reconstruction Era. And if you're one of my students, pay close attention because a lot of this information will be on your test. Have a great day. And thanks for checking out the U.S. History Diva.